The Paradox of Principles, a comprehensive chronicle of the great ethical reckoning. Prologue. The Crucible of Two Americas. The atmosphere inside the CNN town hall studio was not merely tense. It was pressurized, possessing a kinetic weight that seemed to press against the chest of every individual present. It was an evening that had been billed as a standard political discourse, a primetime exchange of ideas. Yet the air crackled with the electricity of an impending collision that transcended mere policy disagreement. This was to be a confrontation of fundamental worldviews. The studio, illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of television lighting, had become a microcosm of a fractured nation, a visual representation of the two Americas forced into a singular, uncomfortable confinement. The audience was packed so densely that the collective anxiety seemed to radiate like a physical heat wave, blurring the lines between spectator and participant. On the left side of the room, the visual language was one of defiance and institutional allegiance. Buttons signaling the resistance were pinned prominently to lapels. Tote bags from National Public Radio were clutched like talismans of intellectual superiority, and T-shirts emblazoned with slogans defending democracy in various shades of indignation created a sea of blue. On the opposing side, the iconography was starkly different, unapologetic and bold. Crimson MAGA hats were worn as badges of honor. Gadsden flags with their coiled serpents were draped casually over shoulders, and slogans encapsulating the populist frustration with the status quo were visible on apparel. These were two distinct tribes, two divergent realities crammed into one room, both waiting for a spark. Jake Tapper, the veteran moderator positioned precariously between these opposing tectonic plates of political sentiment, sat with the resigned posture of a man who realized he was witnessing a force of nature rather than a debate. He appeared to understand, even before the first word was uttered, that the control of the narrative had already slipped from his grasp. This event was not destined to be a moderated discussion with polite time limits and rehearsed talking points. It was evolving rapidly into a public prosecution, a trial of character played out on live television. JD Vance stood at the center of the stage, projecting a demeanor that was unnervingly calm and remarkably still. He carried the distinct bearing of a United States Marine, a posture of disciplined readiness that never truly dissipates, regardless of how many years one spends in tailored business suits instead of combat uniforms. He appeared not merely as a politician seeking approval, but as a seasoned prosecutor who had argued complex cases before judges known to dismantle lawyers with ease. He was the Yale law graduate who had walked the halls of the elite, but had never severed the emotional cord connecting him to the working-class roots of the Rust Belt. He was ready. Opposite him stood Professor Jamie Raskin, the embodiment of the Washington establishment's intellectual vanguard. With a quarter-century of teaching constitutional law at American University and a pedigree that included Harvard Law, Raskin was the celebrated ethics crusader of his party. He was the lead impeachment manager, a prominent member of the January 6th committee, and the man viewed by his supporters as the moral compass of the Congress. Yet, as the confrontation commenced, Raskin adjusted his glasses, a small, fleeting gesture, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but a tell nonetheless. It was a signal of internal unease, a microscopic crack in the facade of academic confidence. Vance noticed it immediately, filing the information away in the prosecutorial archive of his mind, knowing that this nervous tick would serve as the barometer for the pressure he was about to apply. Part I. The Architecture of Concealment. The narrative arc of the evening began with a foundational premise. Professor Raskin was a man who had built his entire public identity on the pillars of ethics, transparency, and the rigorous policing of conflicts of interest. He had authored books on the fragility of democracy that were hailed as profound. He had delivered thunderous speeches on the floor of the House regarding the necessity of accountability. He had filed complaints and held hearings to root out corruption. He was the self-appointed guardian of the Republic's virtue. However, Vance's opening gambit was not a defense of his own positions, but a piercing inquiry into the integrity of the accuser. The question was simple, deadly in its precision, and stripped of all rhetorical flourish. During the 8-month interval where the substantial financial assets accrued by his wife were withheld from the American citizenry, precisely which constitutional principle was the professor upholding? The silence that followed was heavy. Vance was stripping away the layers of academic prestige to reveal a stark contradiction. While the professor was preoccupied with lecturing the nation on the sacred duty of transparency, he had seemingly exempted himself from the very rules he championed. Federal law is unambiguous regarding the disclosure of spousal income and assets. It is a statute of such fundamental clarity that it belongs in a high school civics curriculum, not the complex debates of constitutional scholars. Yet, for 25 years, the man who taught law students about the ethical obligations of public servants had failed to adhere to this baseline requirement. The accusation was specific. Raskin had waited 8 months, over 240 days, to inform the American people that his wife had received over $1 million in stock from a company with deep, complex connections to the Federal Reserve. This was not framed as a clerical error or a bureaucratic oversight. It was presented as a violation of the public trust. When challenged, Raskin reverted to his natural habitat, the lecture hall. He launched into a prepared soliloquy, invoking the spirits of the Founding Fathers. He spoke of James Madison's vision of a republic, of Thomas Jefferson's warnings against corruption, of Alexander Hamilton's advocacy for institutional integrity. His tone was that of a patient educator, explaining the nuances of governance to a classroom of slow learners. Secure in his intellectual superiority, the left side of the audience nodded in rhythmic agreement, finding comfort in the familiar cadence of his moralizing. Vance, however, stood silent, arms crossed, allowing the professor to weave his tapestry of historical references. He waited for nearly a minute, letting the academic jargon fill the room, before he reached into his jacket and produced the evidence. It was a single document, a financial disclosure form, filed late in the summer of the previous year. It was a public record, accessible to anyone with an internet connection, yet, in Vance's hand, it became a weapon. He held it up, not for Raskin, but for the cameras, for the audience, for the nation. Raskin paused mid-sentence. His hand went to his glasses again. The tell. Vance began to dissect the document with surgical precision. He noted that while the disclosure contained the standard portfolio of a wealthy career politician, the story lay in the empty spaces, in the dates that didn't match, in the silence that had stretched for 8 months. Vance employed a powerful rhetorical device to bridge the gap between the millionaire politician and the average citizen. He asked the audience to imagine their own lives. He spoke of the worker who receives a $500 bonus, a sum that signifies a month of groceries, a car repair, or a fleeting moment of financial relief. He described the fear that ordinary Americans feel towards the Internal Revenue Service, the knowledge that a single mistake, a single unreported dollar, could bring the full weight of the federal government crashing down upon them. They follow the rules not out of saintly virtue, but out of necessity and fear of consequences. Yet, here was Jamie Raskin, whose wife had cashed in a windfall of over $1 million, a life-changing fortune, retire early money, and he had said nothing. For 8 months, while he was on television every night, demanding accountability from others, while he was leading impeachment trials, while he was writing books on ethics, he was in violation of federal law. Raskin attempted to invoke the tragic loss of his son, Tommy, a genuine and heartbreaking event that garnered universal sympathy. Vance, however, navigated this delicate terrain with a combination of respect and ruthlessness. He acknowledged the grief, validating the pain of losing a child, but he refused to allow it to serve as a blanket immunity for ethical failures. He pointed out the cold, hard logic found in the ethics complaints. If Representative Raskin was capable of performing his high-profile duties, writing books, giving interviews, leading the charge on impeachment, then, surely, the administrative task of filing a disclosure form was within his capacity. The grief argument was dismantled, revealed not as the cause of the delay, but as a shield used to deflect criticism. When pressed for a simple yes or no regarding whether he violated the law, Raskin crumbled into caveats, eventually forced to admit the filing was late. The first round concluded with the establishment of a devastating theme. Rules for thee, but not for me. Part 2. The mechanics of the revolving door. Having established the failure of disclosure, Vance pivoted to the substance of the hidden money, ushering in the second phase of the prosecution, the revolving door. This was no longer a matter of paperwork. This was a matter of systemic corruption. He introduced the audience to Sarah Bloom Raskin, not as a grieving mother, but as a powerful player in the financial world. He detailed her trajectory, leaving her high-ranking post as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, one of the most powerful financial regulatory positions in the world, and immediately within a month, joining the board of Reserve Trust, a private financial technology company. Vance contextualized this move against the backdrop of Raskin's own rhetoric. For years, the professor had railed against the revolving door, the practice of government officials monetizing their public service by moving to the private sector to lobby the very agencies they once led. He had called it corruption. He had called it a threat to democracy. Yet, his own household was now the exemplar of this practice. The narrative deepened as Vance explained the specific business of Reserve Trust. The company sought a master account from the Federal Reserve, a rare and highly coveted privilege that grants a company direct access to the federal payment system, bypassing the need for intermediary banks. It is the holy grail for a fintech company. The story was laid out with the pacing of a thriller. Reserve Trust applied for this access. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, following standard protocol and rigorous scrutiny, denied the application. It was a dead end. Then came the intervention. Vance revealed that Sarah Bloom Raskin, the former Deputy Treasury Secretary, picked up the phone and called Esther George, the president of the Kansas City Fed, the very institution that had just rejected her company. This was the turning point. A call from a former superior, a colleague, a member of the elite club. Following this conversation, Reserve Trust reapplied. And miraculously, where there was once a denial, there was now approval. Reserve Trust became the only fintech company of its kind in history to be granted a master account. Vance juxtaposed this insider access with the plight of the small business owner. He painted a picture of the entrepreneur trying to secure a loan, facing rejection after rejection from banks, with no one to call, no strings to pull, no old friends at the Federal Reserve. The contrast was visceral. The Raskin family had turned public service into private profit, monetizing connections to the tune of over $1 million when Sarah Bloom Raskin sold her stock. The revolving door was not just a theoretical concept. It was the mechanism that had funded the professor's lifestyle. Vance noted that this scandal was so egregious that it eventually torpedoed Sarah Bloom Raskin's subsequent nomination to the Federal Reserve Board. It was not partisan bickering that stopped her. It was the sheer weight of the ethical cloud, compelling even members of her own party, such as Senator Joe Manchin, to withdraw support. The Senate Republicans boycotted the committee vote, a historic move driven by the refusal to confirm a nominee so deeply entangled in the very corruption the Fed was supposed to police. Part 3. The erosion of due process. The third indictment struck at the core of Raskin's professional identity, the constitutional law professor. Vance shifted the focus to the January 6th committee, a body that Raskin had helped lead and which he viewed as his legacy. However, Vance framed this not as a defense of democracy, but as an assault on the fundamental tenets of the American legal system: due process, the rights of the accused, and the search for truth. Vance interrogated Raskin on the basic principles he taught in his classroom. Did the accused have the right to confront their accusers? Did they have the right to present exculpatory evidence? Did they have the right to cross-examine witnesses? Raskin, trapped by his own academic curriculum, was forced to nod in agreement. These were the bedrocks of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Vance then dismantled the operations of the January 6th committee, exposing it as a tribunal that had stripped away these very rights. He highlighted the structural bias of the committee. Speaker Nancy Pelosi's unprecedented decision to reject the minority party's nominees, Jim Jordan and Jim Banks, was portrayed as the original sin of the investigation. By removing any dissenting voices, any members who would ask the hard questions or challenge the pre-written narrative, the committee was transformed from an investigative body into a show trial. The appointment of two anti-Trump Republicans, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, was dismissed as a facade of bipartisanship, creating a panel of individuals who had already reached their verdict before a single witness was called. Vance accused Raskin of presiding over a process that relied on carefully edited videos, hand-picked testimony, and the exclusion of any evidence that contradicted the preferred narrative. He pointed to the lack of discussion regarding security failures, the National Guard authorization, or the role of federal assets in the crowd. But the most damning accusation was the destruction of evidence. Vance leveled the charge that as the Republicans prepared to retake the House, the committee had deleted transcripts and destroyed records, an act he equated with consciousness of guilt. In the legal world, the destruction of evidence is the hallmark of those who have something to hide. The narrative culminated in the criminal referrals issued by the committee. Vance argued that Raskin had acted as judge, jury, and executioner, referring political opponents for prosecution without ever granting them the opportunity to mount a defense. He challenged Raskin's integrity, asking how a man who teaches the sanctity of due process could participate in a proceeding that mirrored the kangaroo courts of authoritarian regimes rather than the justice system of the United States. Raskin's defense of protecting democracy was inverted. By weaponizing the government against political enemies and stripping them of their rights, he was the one eroding the foundations of the Republic. Part IV. The Mirror of Judicial Hypocrisy. The fourth round of the debate was a masterclass in using an opponent's words against them. Vance turned his attention to Raskin's crusade against the Supreme Court. For months, Raskin had been the loudest voice condemning Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito for alleged ethics violations, demanding strict disclosure rules and recusal standards. He had framed the Supreme Court as an institution in crisis, corrupted by billionaire sugar daddies and undisclosed gifts. Vance pulled out a letter Raskin had written to Chief Justice John Roberts. In it, Raskin had used blistering language, accusing the justices of ignoring the ethics rules that bind every other judge and departing from the truth on their mandatory disclosure forms. Vance let those words hang in the air. Departing from the truth on mandatory disclosure forms. It was a description that fit Raskin himself with terrifying precision. While he was writing these letters, demanding transparency from the highest court in the land, he was simultaneously hiding his own wife's $1 million windfall. Vance seized upon a specific phrase Raskin had used to describe the Roberts Court: "Rules for thee and not for me." It was a catchy, populist slogan intended to paint the justices as out-of-touch elites. Vance turned it into a boomerang. He argued that no phrase better encapsulated the career and conduct of Jamie Raskin. The professor demanded disclosure while practicing concealment. He demanded ethics investigations while violating ethics rules. He attacked the influence of money in politics while his family profited from the revolving door. The comparison was devastating. Raskin had mocked Justice Thomas for accepting hospitality from a friend, labeling it corruption. Yet, his wife's receipt of over $1 million, following a phone call to a federal official, was treated as earned income. Vance exposed the double standard that lay at the heart of Raskin's worldview: the belief that his own intentions were so pure, his own cause so righteous, that the rules governing lesser mortals simply did not apply to him. The applause from the right side of the room grew louder, fueled by the satisfaction of seeing the ethics preacher held to his own sermon. Part V. The Silence of the Watchdog. The final indictment addressed Raskin's current role as the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. In this capacity, Raskin was constitutionally charged with overseeing the executive branch, investigating corruption, and ensuring that the government remained accountable to the people. Vance argued that Raskin had abdicated this duty entirely when it came to the Biden family. Vance listed the evidence that had been uncovered by the committee: bank records showing millions of dollars flowing from foreign entities in China, Romania, and Ukraine to Biden family members; the existence of shell companies; the direct payments and checks. He recounted Raskin's responses to these revelations. Where there should have been curiosity, there was dismissal. Where there should have been investigation, there was obstruction. Raskin had labeled verified bank records as conspiracy theories, fairy tales, and disinformation. Vance framed this not merely as partisan loyalty, but as active complicity. By refusing to investigate, by attacking the investigators, and by providing political cover for the president's family, Raskin was enforcing a two-tiered system of justice. In this system, the average American lives in fear of an audit, while the political elite move millions of dollars through foreign channels with impunity. Vance argued that Raskin had chosen the protection of his party over his oath to the Constitution. He was no longer a watchdog. He was a lapdog for the establishment. Epilogue: the verdict and the horizon. In his closing summation, JD Vance wove these 5 strands: the financial concealment, the revolving door corruption, the destruction of due process, the judicial hypocrisy, and the dereliction of oversight duty into a single, cohesive rope with which to hang the reputation of Jamie Raskin. He painted a portrait of a man who possessed all the credentials of the elite: the degrees from Harvard, the professorships, the titles, but lacked the essential character required for public trust. He addressed the camera directly, breaking the fourth wall to speak to the American people. He declared that Jamie Raskin was not an anomaly, but a prototype. He represented a class of leadership that had become unmoored from the people they governed, a ruling class that believed they were the law, rather than subjects of it. Vance cited other examples: Nancy Pelosi's stock trades, Adam Schiff's intelligence leaks, Eric Swalwell's compromise by foreign agents, to show that this was a systemic rot. The call to action was clear and populist. It was a demand to reject the credentialed hypocrisy of Washington. It was a plea to value character over resumes, integrity over rhetoric. Vance declared that the swamp was real, documented in the bank records and disclosure forms of men like Raskin, and that the only remedy was a relentless exposure of the truth. As the town hall concluded, the reaction was immediate and polarized. The conservative media ecosystem ignited, sharing clips of the debate as definitive proof of the deep state's corruption. The progressive side was left reeling, their champion having been dismantled by the very standards he claimed to uphold. The lasting image of the night was not the cheering crowd or the shouting pundits, but the silent, stunned expression of the professor, adjusting his glasses one last time, realizing that the shield of his moral authority had been shattered by the simple, undeniable weight of his own actions. The reckoning had arrived, and the verdict was delivered not by a judge, but by the exposed truth of his own hypocrisy. The fight, Vance promised, was just beginning. The swamp was deep, but the truth was a weapon that worked. The Great Unraveling, the aftermath of the Raskin-Vance debate, and the shift in American political consciousness. Part 6. The Media Blockade and the Digital Breach. The moments immediately following the conclusion of the town hall represented a secondary conflict, one perhaps even more significant than the debate itself. This was the battle for the narrative. In the traditional corridors of power, the green rooms of major cable networks, the editorial boards of legacy newspapers, and the frantic group chats of political operatives, a palpable sense of panic began to take hold. The established order had witnessed one of their most protected figures, a man insulated by credentials and media adoration, being dismantled on live television, not with insults, but with irrefutable documentation. The immediate instinct of the legacy media apparatus was to engage in a containment strategy, a tactic that had served them well for decades. The plan was simple: ignore the substance, attack the tone, and change the subject. Within minutes, the talking heads on the sympathetic networks began to frame the event not as an exposure of corruption, but as an assault on decorum. They characterized Vance's methodical presentation of evidence as aggressive, mean-spirited, and disrespectful to a grieving father. The headlines that began to populate the chyrons avoided the words "reserve trust." Instead, they focused on clashes, heated exchanges, and partisan attacks. The goal was to sanitize the event, to strip away the incriminating context, and present it to the casual viewer as just another example of Washington bickering. They relied on the assumption that the average American, tired and distracted, would not dig deeper. However, this strategy, which had effectively shielded the political class for a generation, collided violently with the reality of the new digital landscape. While the legacy media attempted to erect a blockade around the truth, the digital breach had already occurred. The clips of the debate did not need the permission of network executives to spread. They moved with the viral velocity of a wildfire across social media platforms. The specific segment where Vance utilized Raskin's own rules for thee but not for me, quote, against him, was shared millions of times within hours. It appeared on X, formerly Twitter, on TikTok, on independent podcasts, and in the email chains of neighborhood watch groups. This phenomenon revealed a critical shift in the architecture of information. The American people were no longer waiting for the 6 p.m. news to tell them what was important. They were seeing the raw footage themselves. They saw the pauses, the nervous gestures, the inability of the professor to answer simple yes or no questions. They saw the tell of the hand reaching for the glasses. The attempt by the establishment press to contextualize or bury the story only served to radicalize the viewers further. It confirmed the very thesis Vance had presented, that there is a protective ring around the elite, a swamp that looks after its own. The silence of the major outlets regarding the specific details of the Reserve Trust scandal became a story in itself, further eroding trust in the institution of journalism. Part 7. The Psychology of Betrayal. To understand the sheer magnitude of the reaction to this debate, one must delve into the psychological state of the American electorate in the mid-2020s. The anger that erupted following the exposure of Jamie Raskin was not born in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of accumulating frustration. The citizenry had lived through a period of profound economic dislocation, where inflation had eroded their savings, and the cost of living had made the American dream feel increasingly like a mirage. They had been told repeatedly by their leaders that the economy was strong, that their struggles were temporary, and that they just needed to work harder. Into this volatile mix came the revelation of the Raskin family's fortune. It was not just the amount of money over $1 million that stung. It was the method of its acquisition. For the average worker, wealth is the result of labor, of time exchanged for wages, often at great personal cost. For the Raskins, as revealed by Vance, wealth was the result of access. It was the product of a phone call, a connection, a title. This struck a nerve deep within the American psyche, violating the core ethos of fair play. The betrayal was compounded by Raskin's brand. He was not a corporate raider or a brazen capitalist. He was the self-styled champion of the little guy, the advocate for democracy, the voice of ethical purity. To discover that the ethics preacher was quietly enriching himself through the very mechanisms he publicly condemned created a sense of cognitive dissonance that quickly turned to rage. It is a peculiar truth of politics that voters will often forgive a scoundrel who admits to being a scoundrel, but they will never forgive a saint who is revealed to be a sinner. The hypocrisy is the unforgivable sin. This psychological break extended to the Democratic base as well. For years, progressive voters had invested their hopes in figures like Raskin, believing them to be the bulwark against corruption. They had defended him, donated to him, and amplified his message. The debate forced them to confront the uncomfortable reality that their hero was, in material terms, indistinguishable from the corporate interests they claimed to oppose. The disillusionment was palpable in the online forums and community groups of the left. While many remained silent, unwilling to aid the opposition, the enthusiasm evaporated. The moral high ground, which had been the primary currency of the Raskin brand, had been liquidated in a single evening. Part 8. The End of Credentialism. One of the most profound subtexts of the Vance-Raskin confrontation was the clash between credentials and reality. Jamie Raskin represented the pinnacle of the credentialed class. His authority was derived from his resume. Harvard Law, American University, the titles, the books, the applause of the Academy. For decades, American politics has been dominated by the belief that governance is the province of the experts, that those with the right degrees and the right pedigree are best suited to rule. Vance, despite his own elite education, positioned himself as the avatar of reality, the world of consequences. He attacked the idea that credentials act as a substitute for character. Throughout the debate, Raskin attempted to retreat into the fortress of his expertise, using complex legal theories and historical analogies to deflect from simple questions of right and wrong. He tried to intellectualize his way out of an ethical corner. Vance refused to play that game. He kept pulling the conversation back to the concrete: the date of the filing, the name on the check, the log of the phone call. This dynamic signaled the end of the era of blind deference to experts. The American public, having witnessed experts get major issues wrong, from foreign policy interventions to economic forecasts, was no longer impressed by the title of professor. When Raskin tried to explain that the technicalities of filing requirements were complex, the audience didn't hear an expert explaining the law. They heard a guilty man making excuses. The debate demonstrated that, in the court of public opinion, common sense and documented facts now outweigh the prestige of position. The professor was schooled by the practitioner, and the lesson was that in a democracy, no degree grants immunity from the truth. Part IX. The Domino Effect and the Purge of the Swamp. The exposure of Jamie Raskin was not an isolated incident. It was the first domino in a potential chain reaction that threatened the structural integrity of the Washington establishment. The phrase, "drain the swamp," had been a slogan for years, often dismissed as rhetoric. However, Vance provided a blueprint for how to operationalize it. The method was not vague accusations, but forensic accounting. It was the weaponization of the public record. In the weeks following the town hall, a new energy infused the oversight committees and independent investigative journalists. If Raskin, the gold standard of ethics, could be compromised, who else? The scrutiny turned inward on the Capitol. Citizen researchers began digging into the financial disclosures of other career politicians, looking for the telltale gaps, the suspiciously timed stock trades, the family members sitting on the boards of companies regulated by their spouses. The Raskin standard became a new metric in political discourse. Any politician launching a moral crusade against their opponents was immediately subjected to a forensic audit of their own conduct. The defense of "it's just how Washington works" was no longer acceptable. The debate had moved the Overton window, making previously tolerated corruptions politically fatal. This shift had terrifying implications for the permanent political class. The system of mutual protection where opposing parties would performatively attack each other in public but protect each other's financial interests in private had been breached. Vance had broken the unwritten rule of the club: you do not look at the bank accounts. By doing so, he signaled that the truce was over. The swamp was no longer a safe harbor. It was a target-rich environment. Part X. The path forward, a new covenant. As the dust settled on the debate, the conversation shifted to the future. What does accountability look like in practice? The viral spread of the video was a start, but as the closing monologue emphasized, it was only the beginning. The call to action was not just about voting. It was about a fundamental restructuring of the citizen-representative relationship. The demand for term limits moved from a fringe issue to a central plank of the populist platform. The argument was simple: careerism breeds corruption. Raskin's 25 years in the system had not made him more ethical. They had made him more comfortable with the loopholes. The only way to prevent the formation of a ruling aristocracy was to ensure that public service was temporary. Furthermore, the debate ignited a demand for a no-exemptions legal standard. If a citizen can be audited for a $600 transaction, a congressman must be audited for $1 million one. If an insider trading law applies to a Wall Street trader, it must apply to the Speaker of the House. The rules for thee but not for me era was being rejected not just in rhetoric, but in the demands for legislative reform. The ultimate legacy of the Vance-Raskin debate was the realization that the power to correct the course of the nation resided not in the hands of the media, or the donors, or the party bosses, but in the hands of an awakened and informed citizenry. The video that ended with "Let's go" was not a conclusion. It was a commencement order. It was a directive to every American to stop accepting the hypocrisy as inevitable, and to start demanding the honest government they were promised. The mask had slipped, the fraud was exposed, and for the first time in a long time, the people could see the faces of those who ruled them clearly. The fear had shifted from the governed to the governors, and in that shift lay the hope for a restored republic. The architecture of accountability had been drafted. Now, it was up to the people to build it.